Well, hello and welcome to part 2 of chapter 6 on preventive control management components. I wanted to break this chapter up into 2 separate parts just because it can get a little bit overwhelming to go through everything in one sitting. So we are kind of on the same theme here. We're talking about management components. In part 1, we tackled monitoring and corrective actions. And then if you think about the beginning of that part, we looked at the bullet points of those 3 management components, and the third one was verification. So that's what we're going to tackle in this part, and we'll also look at some examples of how these management components play out in the food safety plan. So first of all, let's take a look at the definition of verification under this rule. And as I said in part 1, this part gets a little bit confusing if you're trained in HACCP, so I'll do my best to tease that out as we go, but please read everything very carefully as we go through. So verification is the application of methods, procedures, tests, and other evaluations in addition to monitoring to determine whether a control measure or combination of control measures is or has been operating as intended, and to establish the validity of the food safety system. So under this umbrella of verification in FSMA, we have several different things that qualify as verification. When we think about verification, we mostly tend to think about verification of implementation and effectiveness, and we'll talk about exactly what that means as we go through here. But when we think about verifying that a preventive control is working, that's usually what we're talking about, is verification of implementation and effectiveness. Where this gets a little bit hairy is that validation is considered a verification activity. And what we mean by validation is, did we design the food safety plan correctly? So this kind of follows a more scientific-based definition of validation than what we saw with the HACCP programs. So validation is designing the food safety plan, designing the preventive controls. You can do validation before you even own a food facility, and the other verification activities are all after the fact, after you've implemented the preventive controls, and now you need to make sure they're being done correctly and are still working correctly. Okay, so that was a lot, just a little preview of kind of where we're going with this, but we'll work through all of this through these next couple of slides. Here is the actual text of the regulation going over the verification section, part 507.45. Verification activities must include, as appropriate to the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system, validation in accordance with the validation section, verification that monitoring is being conducted, verification that the appropriate decisions about corrective actions are being made as required by the corrective actions section, verification of implementation and effectiveness, and reanalysis of the food safety plan. And of course, all of these need to be conducted in accordance with the records keeping section of the regulation. So you can see that the actual regulation kind of echoes the image that we saw on the last slide, where we have verification as a whole and then validation and all of the other verification activities kind of under that verification umbrella. If you don't write it down, you can't prove that it happened, right? So as you've seen in the other chapters so far, documentation is absolutely essential to this entire food safety plan and to meeting the requirements of FSMA. You need to document everything. You need to write everything down when it comes to your preventive controls, okay? Here's the definition of validation. So now we're going to get into a little bit more of the specifics behind the differences between validation and the rest of the verification activities. So validation is obtaining and evaluating scientific and technical evidence that a control measure, combination of control measures, or the food safety plan as a whole, when properly implemented, is capable of effectively controlling the identified hazards. Okay? Is it capable of controlling those hazards? Is it the appropriate thing to do to control a specific hazard? And to say yes or no, and to order to validate a preventive control, you're going to have to use scientific literature, you're going to have to use technical evidence, and actual evidence and data that it is the appropriate thing to do to control a hazard. Okay, and again, like I said before, this is something that can be done before you even own a feed mill or any food facility. This is just the simply design process, everything you can do beforehand that says, yes, this is the appropriate way to do this. Yes, these are the parameters that I need to meet according to best practices and what we know in the scientific community. Here's a simple chart that kind of puts verification and validation side by side. What I don't like about this one is that technically validation is a verification activity. So what we're looking at here is validation versus the rest of the verification activities. Okay, so on the right-hand side, we have validation. We just looked at that definition, and then we ask ourselves, can the food safety plan, when implemented, actually control the identified hazards? Is it designed correctly? Where the other verification activities are the preventive controls in the food safety plan actually being properly implemented in a way that can control the hazard? Okay, so is this thing that I designed through the validation process, I then do verification to make sure that it's actually being done and it's actually still effective. Okay? I hope that clarifies a little bit there. We're going to dive a little bit more into some of this as we go through. Here's the actual regulation on validation. This is 507.47. You must validate that the preventive controls identified and implemented in accordance with 507.34 are adequate to control the hazard as appropriate to the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system. The validation of the preventive control has to be overseen by a PCQI. We looked at the list of duties of a PCQI, and validation was on there. They are responsible for writing and making the food safety plan, and validation is part of that. So making sure that they go through the steps to validate all of the preventive controls is the responsibility of the PCQI. Now, keep in mind that the ultimate responsibility for Subpart C, which is the world we're living in right now, is the responsibility of the owner, operator, or agent in charge, but the actual food safety plan and the validation activities fall under the responsibility of the PCQI. It can be overseen by someone else. It doesn't say that the PCQI has to read all of the scientific studies, but they need to oversee that process. So since validation is directly related to the design of your food safety plan, the regulation asks that ideally validation is going to happen before you implement any part of your food safety plan. However, there is a part B here that kind of gives you a little bit of leeway there. If you can't validate a control measure before you implement it, you have within 90 calendar days after production of the applicable animal food begins, or within a reasonable time frame, as long as the PCQI can justify that and writes down that justification. So the FSBCI or FDA recognizes that there are some situations that validation is just not going to happen before the implementation of a food safety plan. But I think a good business practice would be to make sure you have everything validated before your compliance date that we looked at in Chapter 1. But again, you might already be past that date and maybe that's not possible at this point. I think there's also other situations where you could validate your preventive control by running a batch of feed, and that could be part of your validation process. So technically you're starting production, but it's a situation where you're still trying to validate your food safety plan. So anyways, ideally before the food safety plan is implemented, but within 90 days. If you can't do it within 90 days, just make sure that you justify it. You also need to validate anytime you change a control measure. This is mostly when it's going to, it's going to significantly change your process, or it's going to introduce new hazards. But anytime you make a change to a preventive control, you need to validate it. Again, ideally before you start implementing that change, or within 90 days, or when you can, given justification. But make sure that you actually go through that thought process of validating any change in your control when you're making those changes. Also, when you do a reanalysis and your food safety team realizes that you need to do some validation or revalidation of some preventive control, then you also need to do it at that point. And all of this needs to include obtaining and evaluating scientific and technical evidence. Or when such evidence is not available, you can conduct in-house studies as well. So a lot of facilities already have some historical data and some in-house studies that they already have on record, and that could be used as part of your validation process, or you could do new in-house studies as part of your validation process as well. You do not need to validate sanitation controls, and we're going to talk about why that is as we go through examples of sanitation controls. You don't need to validate the recall plan, and you don't need to validate the supply chain program. If you are using an other preventive control, you should validate that if it makes sense. If it doesn't really make sense, then the PCQI can say why it doesn't make sense. So there's some justification built into that part as well. But another just kind of a catch-all for anything that falls into that other preventive controls category, and then the PCQI can use their best judgment on whether that needs to be validated or not. So let's talk about some resources that we can use for validation. As it specifically says in the regulation, please, please, please use scientific data. Make sure you go through the effort to find any information out there possible that can help you with this validation process. And some of these might be similar to where the sources you use to learn about hazards. There may be information in those same places to help you control those hazards or give you ideas of how to control those hazards. Like, for example, the FSPCA website is constantly working to list more scientific information or give you links to places you can go to get information. If you can, peer-reviewed scientific literature is great. That is an excellent, valid, reliable source of information to use. And that's particularly important for biological hazards, and most of the scientific literature out there that we're talking about in this situation is going to be based on biological hazards. There are also microbial modeling programs that could be helpful, trade association guidance or white papers, FDA guidances, internal and external scientific studies, cooperative extension websites for many universities. I know here in Oregon we have a great research university, Oregon State University, and they have a great extension service that has a lot of good information out there. Keep in mind that some of this may also relate to some human food studies, particularly those biological hazards. So don't feel limited to just the animal food world if you are dealing with a hazard or trying to validate a preventive control that kind of crosses over into the human food world. So that could absolutely be a reliable source of information for you. So to summarize validation as a verification activity, some of the strategies we're going to use are to use scientific principles and scientific data. We can conduct in-plant observation or tests, and then of course going to our guidance documents available to us as well. When it's required, ideally before the food safety plan is implemented or within 90 days, or if you can justify it after that. and when any unexpected problems indicate the need for reanalysis. So we talked about corrective actions in the last section in part 1 of chapter 6. So if you're constantly having to do corrective actions, then maybe it's time to look at your validation for your preventive controls and see if you need to revalidate some things. It's not required for supply chain controls, sanitation controls, or the recall plan, but like I said, we're going to talk about some situations where validation might be appropriate. Okay, now that we've covered the validation section of verification, let's talk about verification of implementation and effectiveness. Now, this section is usually what most people think of when we think of verification. We're going to verify that the preventive control we have in place is being implemented correctly and it is effective. So let's read through the regulation. You must verify that the preventive controls are consistently implemented and are effectively and significantly minimizing or preventing the hazards. To do so, you must conduct activities that include the following as appropriate to the facility, the animal food, and the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system. Number 1 is calibration of the monitoring or verification instruments. Number 2 is product testing for pathogens, for example. And number 3 would be environmental monitoring. So those are all examples of things that we're going to do to verify that our preventive control is being implemented and it is being effective still. We can also use review of records as a verification activity. So this kind of falls under that verification of implementation side of things. Review of the following records by or under the oversight of a preventive controls qualified individual to ensure the records are complete, the activities reflected in the records occurred in accordance with the food safety plan, and the preventive controls are effective and appropriate decisions were made about corrective action. So a few things to look for with your records review. Are the records complete? Is there something missing? Was something scratched out and initialed instead of being fixed or explained? The activities reflected are happening in accordance with the food safety plan. Did they write down everything they were supposed to write down? Do the records reflect the procedures that you've outlined in your food safety plan? The preventive controls are effective. So all of those records that we're getting back say, yes, we're in line, yes, we're in our parameter values. And when we're looking at corrective action records, we need to make sure that the appropriate decisions were made in that corrective action process. And now we have a couple of stipulations here when it comes to records review. First one, monitoring and corrective action records need to be reviewed within 7 working days after the records are created. Okay? That's kind of the standard. If you have records review built into your preventive control as a verification activity, the guideline is that needs to be done within 7 days. Okay? We also understand that that's not always possible, so there is a piece in here that says you can write a justification for when that exceeds 7 working days. Also, I want to reiterate and reassure the PCQIs out there that this can be under the oversight of the PCQI. Usually when people first read this, they start to panic a little bit that their job is going to be just records review from here on out, but keep in mind that this does specifically say it can be under the oversight of a PCQI. It doesn't directly have to be the PCQI, okay? When you're doing calibration and testing and supply chain verification activities, that all needs to be done within a reasonable time frame as well. So there's no 7-day number on those types of records, but this does say it needs to be a reasonable time frame. Okay? And then, of course, if you find that there's any other verification activities that make sense for your preventive control, maybe there's something you're already doing that doesn't quite fit within these other bullet points, but it does make sense and it is best practice for your facility, then you can include that in your food safety plan as a verification activity as well. So here's an example of a verification activity. So this falls under our records review section, and this is the same batch record that we looked at earlier that Chad Smith made for us before he messed up. This wasn't the one that we needed corrective action on, but we can see down at the bottom we just have a single line that says verification of reviewer's signature, and that was done by Sue R. Quality, and you can see it was within 7 days of the date that this was created. It was created on 3/4 and it was reviewed on 3/8. Okay. Assumably, Sue is our PCQI, but they can appoint someone else to do this. So maybe Sue is not our PCQI, but was appointed to review these records. Okay, it's as simple as that. So Chad Smith creates the record, and within 7 days, Sue is going to look over this to make sure that he's following procedures and that our preventive control is being implemented as it was designed. So part A of this section 50749 showed us all of the things that we could do as verification of implementation and effectiveness activities. And part B tells us that if we're going to do those things, we need to write them down. Okay, so again, establishing and implementing written procedures for all of our verification of implementation and effectiveness. Specifically, when we're talking about calibrating instruments, we need to make sure that we have established procedures for the methods of doing that, and then also how frequently that is going to be. Again, like I said, frequency isn't determined in this regulation, but it needs to be adequate for the level of risk that your facility is in, or the level of risk associated with that hazard specifically. You also need to make sure that you have procedures for product testing, and those procedures need to be scientifically valid, identify the test organism or other analytes or indicator organisms, specify the procedures for identifying samples, including their relationship to specific lots of product, include the procedures for sampling, including the number of samples and the sampling frequency, identify the tests conducted, including the analytical methods used, identify the laboratory conducting the testing, and include the corrective action procedures that would be associated with when this preventive control does not get implemented correctly. Okay, so let's talk about some examples of verification procedures. I think we talked about a lot of these already, but just to kind of put it all in one spot. So we can verify our processes by looking at the effectiveness, checking equipment calibration, product testing. We can verify our sanitation by things like visual inspection or environmental monitoring. And then we can kind of look at the system a little bit more holistically through the reanalysis process or doing internal audits of your food safety system. So to verify all of our verification activities, first of all, validation is a verification activity that's used to validate a preventive control. We can use things like scientific papers and in-house tests to help us make sure that our preventive control is designed correctly. We can also verify that our preventive control is being implemented by looking at the monitoring and reviewing those records within 7 days. Same thing with corrective actions. All of that's going to be documented, and we can review those decisions within 7 days. And then when we're talking more about effectiveness and implementation on the machinery side of things, that's going to be things like calibration records, product testing, and environmental testing. So to summarize all of Chapter 6 in our preventive control management components, preventive controls require monitoring, corrective actions and corrections, validation, verification, and verification of implementation, and effectiveness. Different types of controls may not require all preventive control management components. The preventive controls qualified individual is responsible for oversight of the preventive control management components. Now we're going to take a look at an example of how this plays out in the food safety plan. So again, we're in ABC feed mill. They make multi-species medicated and non-medicated feeds. So now we're looking at the second table that we're going to include in our food safety plan. This is table 2. This is a description of our preventive controls. So the first few columns on this table are just carried over from table number 1, where we identified our hazards and evaluated them and say yes or no, they need a preventive control. So all the ones that we said yes to now get transferred over to table 2. And remember, copper toxicity in sheep was the hazard requiring a preventive control. The appropriate control, we also wrote this down on table number 1, but now we're going to get into a little bit more detail. But we're going to be using procedures for ensuring correct manual weighing and addition of sheep mineral premix. We decided this was going to be preventive control number 2, and it is a process control. Okay, this is something that we do in our facility, part of our manufacturing process that we're going to use to control a hazard. Parameters, well, there's our 10% deviation. Okay, we established that. We looked at the SOP that has that 10% deviation on it. Here's the next part of table 2. These are all of our management components. So these were all the things that we talked about in chapter 6. So we're going to talk about monitoring first. So what am I actually monitoring? I'm going to monitor the use of designated ingredients in each batch and throughout the day. How I'm going to do that, I'm going to reconcile the ingredients by using the batching records and that calculation of actual versus theoretical total use. This is going to be happening daily, and our batch operator is going to be doing it for us. Okay, so to describe your monitoring activities, you need to tell us what is happening, how you're going to do it, the frequency, and who. So to finish table 2, I'm going to address my other management component of the corrective actions and corrections. Now let's read through some examples of these corrective actions. If an incorrect quantity or premix was included, identify the root cause, retrain employees or recalibrate equipment as appropriate, determine the scope of the problem by evaluating records and/or sampling and analyzing animal food when necessary, either blend, divert, hold and test or dispose of affected animal food to prevent it from entering commerce. And 5, reanalyze the food safety plan as necessary. So those 5 things kind of directly address the 5 bullet points that we went over in the corrective action section of this regulation. We're identifying and we are making sure that we reduce the likelihood of it recurring again. We are preventing it from entering commerce and evaluating all of the animal food. And then, of course, reanalyzing if necessary. Okay? Some of the records that are going to be created, as I've said before, this is a records generating process. So we saw some batching records. We saw daily designated ingredient reconciliation records. Of course, there's going to be some corrective action records produced if we have to do a corrective action. Daily scale accuracy records, that kind of plays into our verification, what kind of records are produced through verification, and annual scale calibration as well as a verification. Here's an example of table 3. We separated this out from the other table to address the specific management component of verification. I think mostly just because there are several different parts of verification. So the first section in here, the first type of verification is validation. Well, take a look at this. Validation, this company put NA in the validation description. But I told you a little bit earlier, that validation is required for a process control. Okay, so I want you to take a minute to think about why this company would be able to get away with putting NA in this validation description. What it comes down to is thinking about this actual preventive control and how it's carried out. So back in the description of the preventive control, I told you that Chad Smith was going to batch and weigh our feed as the preventive control. Of course, I have procedures for being able to do that. So this is a human following a procedure to do something by hand. And if you think about how could I validate that? How could I show that humans can weigh and read things properly? Okay, so the answer is we can't really. So what this comes down to is that this is a preventive control implemented by a human, and it's very hard to validate that humans can do things that we tell them to. Okay, so that's why we put an NA in this table to kind of have that conversation about when we can't actually validate something. Now, through conversations with industry, we've talked about validating instead of putting an NA in this box, an inspector might rather see an explanation of why you couldn't validate. Every inspector I've talked to has told me that if they see an NA, they're going to start asking questions. Okay, so while you can get away with this, while you can put an NA in this box, I think it's a better practice to explain why you couldn't validate this. Okay, and then we also have some other things that we could validate. For example, the parameters that we established in the reconciliation. So what was the justification behind those parameters? Why did we choose that 10%? Okay, so I think anytime you think about validation, there's 2 components. You've got what is actually doing this for you, that piece of machinery, that person, that activity. And you have the parameters that you've established that you've asked that piece of machinery or that person to meet. Okay, so I kind of want to guide you to be thinking about validation from 2 perspectives, the machinery or person or activity and the parameters. So even if you can't validate one of those, you can at least have a conversation about the other one. Okay? The next type of verification has to do with making sure is the implementation part, the monitoring and corrective actions. So we're just going to describe there that any monitoring and corrective action records are going to be reviewed within 7 working days. Great, that's exactly what the regulation wants us to do, so there's a good description of that. Okay, and then verification of implementation and effectiveness gets a little bit more complicated. Remember, we're verifying that implementation is happening, so that includes our machinery and making sure that it's consistently working correctly. So we're going to check the accuracy every day, and we're going to do an annual scale calibration. And then for the effectiveness side of this, I'm going to do product testing when necessary. Okay? Reanalysis, that should look familiar, every 3 years or as necessary. All right.